There are certain nights in military history that soldiers on the losing side never fully leave behind. Nights that surface again and again in letters, in interrogation reports, in halting post-war testimony, given decades later by men who still struggled to put the experience into words. One such night unfolded in the Egyptian desert in the final days of October 1942. When German infantry dug into positions near El Alamein, found themselves facing an assault by the Black Watch, one of Scotland's oldest and most storied regiments, and came away from those few hours of darkness with an account of combat so intense that it would be repeated among German veterans for years afterward as a kind of cautionary tale about exactly what British and Commonwealth infantry, at their most determined, were capable of achieving. To understand why this particular night carried such lasting weight in German memory, it helps to set the scene properly. By late October 1942, the war in North Africa had settled into a grinding, deeply entrenched struggle, with German and Italian forces holding a heavily fortified line studded with dense minefields, machine gun positions, and carefully sighted artillery, all designed to blunt exactly the kind of infantry assault that British commanders were now preparing to launch. German soldiers manning these positions had spent weeks improving their defenses, confident that any attacking force would be forced to cross open, heavily mined ground under direct observation, a prospect that ordinarily favored the defender enormously. What none of them fully anticipated was the sheer scale of the artillery preparation that would precede the assault, nor the particular ferocity of the infantry that would follow it into their positions once the barrage lifted. The attack began, as so many of these accounts describe, with an opening bombardment that soldiers remembered less as a series of individual explosions and more as a single continuous overwhelming wall of noise and light that seemed to swallow the horizon whole. A German infantryman sheltering in a forward position that night later described the ground itself trembling continuously beneath him for what felt like an impossibly long stretch of time, the air thick with dust and the acrid smell of cordite. Communication with neighboring positions cut almost immediately as field telephone lines were severed by the sheer weight of shellfire. It was into this chaos, while the barrage was still tearing up the ground ahead of them, that the Black Watch began their advance, moving forward in the darkness behind a creeping curtain of their own supporting fire, timed with a precision that allowed them to close much of the distance to the German line before the defenders had fully recovered from the shock of the bombardment itself. What followed, according to numerous German accounts collected both during interrogation of prisoners taken that night and in later post-war recollections, was a period of close-quarters fighting that left a deep and lasting impression on every survivor who experienced it. German soldiers described emerging from shelter, ears still ringing from the bombardment, disoriented by dust and darkness, only to find Scottish infantry already among their positions, moving with a speed and aggression that gave defenders almost no time to organize any kind of coherent resistance. One German NCO, describing the fighting in a statement given shortly after his capture, said that his position had been overrun so quickly that he barely had time to register what was happening before Black Watch soldiers were already inside the trench line itself, engaging in the kind of brutal, close-range fighting that training exercises back in Germany had prepared him for in theory, but which felt entirely different when it was actually happening around him in the pitch dark. A recurring detail across several of these accounts concerns the psychological disorientation caused by fighting an enemy that seemed to know precisely where they were going, even in near total darkness and amid the confusion of an ongoing barrage. German soldiers trained to expect a more cautious, methodical advance that would give defenders time to reorganize after the initial shock of a bombardment, instead found themselves facing an assault that pressed forward with almost no pause at all, exploiting the confusion of the barrage's aftermath rather than waiting for it to settle. One captured officer, questioned in the days following the attack, admitted with evident and reluctant respect that his own men had simply not been prepared for infantry that moved that fast and that aggressively immediately behind their own artillery fire, a tactic that, while not entirely unfamiliar in principle, had rarely been executed against his unit with such devastating effectiveness in practice. The fighting that night was not without heavy cost to the attackers themselves, and it would be inaccurate and disrespectful to suggest otherwise. Minefields, machine gun positions that survived the initial bombardment, and determined pockets of German resistance inflicted serious casualties on the advancing Scottish infantry, and several accounts from both sides describe the assault as anything but a clean or easy victory. What comes through so consistently in German testimony, however, is not simply the scale of casualties inflicted or received, but a specific and repeated observation about the manner in which the attack continued despite those losses. A German machine gunner, describing the collapse of his own position during the assault, recalled that even as his weapon inflicted visible casualties on the advancing line, the attack itself never seemed to lose momentum. Soldiers continuing to press forward past fallen comrades with what he described, in language translated from his original statement, as a kind of grim, almost mechanical determination that unsettled him more than the volume of fire directed at his own position. This particular quality, the apparent refusal of the attacking force to allow casualties to disrupt the overall momentum of the assault, appears with striking regularity across multiple separate German accounts of that night, suggesting it reflects something genuinely characteristic of how the regiment approached this kind of operation, rather than a single isolated impression from one frightened soldier. Military historians examining these accounts alongside British regimental records have generally attributed this quality to the intensive training and deep unit cohesion for which Highland regiments in general, and the Black Watch in particular, had become known throughout the war. A cohesion built on the kind of close personal bonds between soldiers that allowed sections to continue functioning effectively, even after suffering losses that might have caused less tightly integrated units to falter or hesitate. By the time the fighting for this particular sector had concluded, in the early hours of the following morning, German prisoners taken during the assault gave interrogators a remarkably consistent account of what they had experienced, one that combined genuine professional respect with an unmistakable undertone of shock. Several described the experience in terms that suggested they had gone into that night expecting a conventional infantry assault, something their training and previous combat experience had at least partially prepared them for, only to find themselves facing something that felt qualitatively more intense, faster, and more relentless than anything they had previously encountered on that front. One young soldier, barely out of his teenage years and clearly still processing the events of the previous hours, told his interrogator simply that he had never imagined an infantry attack could move that quickly through a defended position, and that the speed of it, more than anything else, was what he expected to remember for the rest of his life. Word of this engagement spread through German units in the surrounding sector in the days that followed, carried through the informal channels by which soldiers passed stories and warnings among themselves, regardless of what official reports might say. Diaries and letters recovered from German positions in the weeks after the battle occasionally reference the Black Watch by name, sometimes with a kind of wary respect, sometimes simply noting the regiment's reputation as something soldiers in that sector had heard about and hoped never to personally encounter. This pattern, a specific unit's reputation traveling ahead of its actual physical presence on a given stretch of front, mirrors a phenomenon observed with several other Highland and Commonwealth formations throughout the war. But the particular intensity of this one engagement seems to have left an especially vivid and lasting impression, precisely because of how starkly it contradicted German expectations of what a night assault against a heavily fortified position could realistically achieve. It is worth considering, too, what this single engagement reveals about the wider character of the fighting at El Alamein more broadly. The battle as a whole is often remembered quite rightly as a story of overwhelming artillery preparation and meticulous logistical planning, the culmination of months of careful buildup in men, material, and coordinated fire support. But engagements like this one, fought at extremely close range in near total darkness, by exhausted infantry advancing on foot through minefields and machine gun fire, remind us that all of that careful planning still ultimately depended on individual soldiers willing to close that final terrifying distance and fight their way into an enemy position with bayonet and rifle, regardless of what the artillery had or had not managed to destroy ahead of them. The Black Watch's performance that night stands as a particularly stark illustration of exactly that willingness, and German testimony from the soldiers who experienced it firsthand offers a rare, unfiltered glimpse of just how effective and how genuinely frightening that willingness could be when executed by a unit trained and bonded to the standard this regiment had achieved. There is a particular section of this engagement described independently by several separate German witnesses concerning the moment the barrage lifted and the true scale of what was advancing toward them became apparent. Soldiers who had spent the preceding hours pressed flat against the walls of their trenches, enduring a bombardment so intense that several later admitted they had genuinely believed they would not survive it, emerged to find visibility reduced almost to nothing by drifting smoke and settling dust, illuminated only by the intermittent flash of continuing artillery fire further along the line. Into this half-light came the leading elements of the Black Watch, moving with a discipline that several German accounts specifically remarked upon, advancing not in the scattered, disorganized rush that exhausted defenders might have hoped for after such a bombardment, but in controlled, purposeful formation. Officers and section leaders clearly maintaining command and direction even amid the smoke and continuing fire. One German defender, describing this moment years later, said that what struck him most forcefully was not fear exactly, but a kind of stunned professional recognition that he was watching soldiers execute a well-rehearsed plan under conditions that would have reduced most units to chaos, and that this composure, more than any individual act of aggression, was what made the assault feel so genuinely formidable. The role of individual leadership during the engagement also features prominently in surviving accounts, both from German soldiers who observed it directly and from the regimental records kept on the British side. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers within the Black Watch are repeatedly credited in post-war analysis with maintaining momentum at moments when the attack might otherwise have stalled, stepping forward to lead sections through gaps in wire or around unexpected pockets of resistance when more senior officers had become casualties or lost contact with parts of their command. This kind of distributed leadership, where junior ranks were trained and trusted to make independent tactical decisions rather than waiting for orders to filter down through a rigid chain of command, appears to have been a significant factor in sustaining the speed and coherence of the assault, even as the situation on the ground grew increasingly confused and fragmented. A German prisoner, describing his own capture during the fighting, recalled being taken not by an officer, but by a young corporal who seemed entirely calm and in control of the small group of soldiers around him, coordinating their next move with a confidence that the German soldier found genuinely surprising given the young man's apparent age and rank. Casualties among the German defenders that night were severe, and the accounts that survive do not shy away from describing the human cost in unflinching terms. A field medic attached to one of the forward positions later wrote about spending the remaining hours of darkness moving between wounded men with dwindling medical supplies, doing what little he could while the sounds of continuing fighting echoed from positions further along the line that had not yet been overrun. He described a particular haunting image that stayed with him for years afterward: a young German soldier, barely conscious from his wounds, repeatedly asking whether the position had held, unaware that the line around him had already collapsed and that he was now, in effect, behind enemy positions rather than in front of them. This kind of detail, small and deeply personal rather than strategically significant, recurs throughout the surviving testimony from that night. A reminder that behind the larger narrative of tactical success and failure lay hundreds of individual human experiences of fear, confusion, and loss that no official report could ever fully capture. German commanders, reviewing the aftermath of the engagement in the days that followed, faced the uncomfortable task of explaining how a well-prepared, heavily fortified position had been overrun so comprehensively in a single night. Several after-action assessments, later recovered and studied by historians, point to a combination of factors beyond simply the fighting quality of the attacking infantry, including the sheer density and accuracy of the preceding artillery bombardment, which had degraded communication and command structures within the defending positions well before the infantry assault even began. But these same assessments consistently return to the performance of the attacking infantry itself as the decisive factor in converting that initial disruption into a genuine breakthrough, noting specifically the speed with which the Black Watch had exploited gaps in the defense before German reserves could be brought forward to seal them. One senior officer, reviewing the engagement for his own superiors, wrote with evident frustration that his reserves, positioned to respond to exactly this kind of breakthrough, had simply not been able to react quickly enough given the pace at which the situation had deteriorated. A criticism that reflects poorly less on the readiness of those specific reserve units and more on just how rapidly the attacking infantry had managed to convert initial success into a fully developed penetration of the German line. The broader significance of this single night's fighting becomes clearer when placed within the context of the wider battle unfolding around it. El Alamein as a whole represented a turning point in the North African campaign, the moment at which Axis forces, worn down by supply shortages and unable to match the scale of Allied material buildup, finally lost the initiative they had held for much of the preceding 2 years of desert fighting. Individual engagements like this one, fought at desperately close range by exhausted infantry on both sides, were the actual mechanism through which that larger strategic shift was achieved, position by position, trench by trench, across a front that stretched for miles through some of the most inhospitable terrain either army had fought over throughout the entire war. It is easy, looking back from the comfortable distance of historical analysis, to describe El Alamein purely in terms of grand strategy and material advantage. But the testimony of the German soldiers who actually experienced that night against the Black Watch offers a necessary corrective. A reminder that grand strategic outcomes were ultimately decided by the courage, skill, and sheer physical endurance of ordinary soldiers fighting through smoke and darkness at ranges measured in meters rather than miles. What makes the surviving German testimony from this engagement particularly valuable to historians is its remarkable consistency across multiple independent sources. Soldiers from different companies, different ranks, and different positions along the line, all describing broadly similar experiences of speed, disorientation, and the unnerving composure of the attacking force, despite having no obvious means of coordinating their accounts with one another in the immediate aftermath of capture or in the years that followed. This kind of independent corroboration lends considerable weight to the overall picture that emerges, one of a genuinely exceptional feat of infantry combat, executed under extraordinarily difficult conditions, that left a lasting and evidently sincere impression on the very soldiers it had been directed against. It stands even within the wider and already remarkable history of Highland regiments during the Second World War, as one of the clearest and most vividly documented examples of exactly why that reputation for ferocity and discipline in the assault had been earned so thoroughly, one desperate, chaotic night at a time. In the years following the war, as veterans on both sides began sharing their experiences more openly, that single night near El Alamein continued to surface in conversations, in regimental histories, and in the occasional post-war meeting between former adversaries, who found, sometimes to their own surprise, a strange kind of mutual respect in discussing what had happened. A German veteran, meeting former Black Watch soldiers at a commemorative event decades after the war, reportedly told them directly that he had never forgotten that night, that the sound of the attack coming through the darkness had stayed with him through the rest of the war and long after it, and that he had come with the distance of many years to genuinely respect the discipline and courage it must have taken to press home an assault of that kind under those conditions. It is a small human coda to a night defined otherwise by chaos and violence, but it captures something important about how these stories eventually settle in memory, not simply as tales of victory or defeat, but as testimony to the particular terrible intensity that certain units, certain nights, and certain soldiers brought to a war that asked an enormous amount of everyone who fought in it, on whichever side of the line they happened to find themselves standing.